So we'll chat after anyway with regards to some of the questions I've put up. Okay, so another PHNX Community Call, so welcome, and this one will be recorded as all the others have been recorded and will be placed in the library for you to go over and have a look at your own frequency, speed, and please feel free to ask any questions you may have to me or anyone else, and we may have the answer or we may not, but we'll find it out for you. So today's call is going to be on the ethical use of emotional mastery in coaching. Now, the reason why this is pretense with the ethical use is because there is and will always be, because of the nature of human beings, predispensation to use something in sometimes a negative way, even though the idea of being in a coaching world should be to use and leverage emotions in a positive way. That is not always the case, and we would be naive to think that that would be the case. So today is going to be around just sense checking a few of the things that might be occurring in the industry, but kind of celebrating the ways in which it's being used positively, but also just going, keep an eye on that with ways in which it might not be being used as positively. So a few questions that is going to be worth thinking about for the end of the call when we break out and have our little chat. Where is emotional intelligence showing up most in your coaching? Where have you seen emotional intelligence used well or poorly in our industry? And I think that question being answered will probably be stoked from a few of the slides that will come up in due course. What is one emotional intelligence skill you develop most as a coach, which is a really good way of kind of reflecting on your own development, your own areas of growth from that particular emotional lens. Where do you think coaching still needs to improve its use of emotional intelligence? And that is, of course, an opinion-based perception, but it's welcome and it should be utilised, as an important factor to consider. So, firstly, there is this idea of, and it's becoming more and more apparent within the industry, I think, is this kind of like competence versus catchphrases, which is something I've started to see more and more of. So, we can see from an branding perspective whereby you might have a individual looking to utilize the idea of emotional intelligence or someone's emotional well-being, emotional needs, in order to be able to sell something, to be able to move into that space and create that connection and essentially put their product or service in plain sight of that individual through emotional branding. Now, that's not a problem as long as there is actually substance behind some of these catchphrases, so to speak. So some of the ideas where we might see like I hold space, or, the holistic transformation expert, um, I help people heal, creating the warrior, good vibes only. Now, essentially, none of these are necessarily bad things. I just need to make very clear on that. But one of the issues that can present itself is that if there is no genuine substance behind it when you think about asking the questions for and during that coaching process, what keeps getting in the way, what's happening between intention and action, and building a sense of depth and understanding around that person's emotional capacity and their decision making and their capability of under moving forward through an emotionally developing journey, then it is really just a whimsical, off the cuff comment or branding, which without it can leave people actually probably in a much more vulnerable position. So I'm just going to reflect back. Herman and Palevi is a well researched piece of well, it's almost like looks at it does look at marketing and how marketing make promises or at least give the perception that something's going to be achieved through this particular product or service, someone engages with that product or service, fails, and then actually their issues are compounded more, which moves them more towards things like learned self-helplessness or dropped in self-esteem, or their low perceived task efficacy and these such things. So by using emotional branding and then not delivering in genuine emotional mastery, can actually leave people in a very downward spiral potentially. So it's important that within the industry we look at actually what's the catchphrase and what is genuine competency behind a coach in their abilities to be able to deliver an effective and ethical, integral journey to someone when it comes to their emotional well-being and that side of the coaching. So, there's just at the bottom of here is an insight question, which I quite like these insight questions. They're not necessarily to be answered per se, and people have their different opinions, but has coaching genuinely become more emotionally intelligent, or have we simply become better at marketing our empathy? And is that empathy even genuine, as a caveat to that insight? So emotional intelligence obviously is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions, and then recognize, understand, and influence the emotions of others. Now, and I've underlined the word influence, and I have had this slide come up before in previous calls, because I think it's really important to know that influencing in a positive way, or allowing someone to have the ability to explore their own, recognize their own, understand their own emotions in parallel with whilst you're doing that as a coach is really important. And sometimes there is a sense of influencing that comes into play, but what we don't want to do is we want to recognize the difference between influence and coercion, or influence and manipulation, or influence and a sense of leveraging. Now, the line is fine, and under no circumstances am I saying that people don't accidentally cross it, because they do. But it's a very important aspect of the whole concept and definition of emotional intelligence and emotional intelligent coaching, where it's important to reflect on, am I influencing this person, or is my language becoming, not in an intentional way necessarily, coercive or manipulative, or leading in essence. So just thinking about some of these, the importance of why emotional intelligence has to exist within a coaching and within a leadership service development and provision as an overall package, if you will. Statistically, research-based, and without any kind of reluctance, I say that it is the difference between success, longevity, and capability on an ongoing basis. And these are just some kind of like statistics here pulled from research, where in some in a very so this 48% variance of success is actually down to data that was pulled from personal training research. So coaches that had and integrated emotional intelligence within their product, service, and delivery as coaches actually had a predictive variance of 48%. So their success rate increased by an incredible amount. And it meant that they were able to have a longer, more sustained existence within the industry, and also subsequently the impact that they would have had on their clients, although not measured. We know that if they're there and they're having this kind of longevity, consistency, rapport building, delivery, will inevitably mean more success for their clients. So that's the reality of that within the that kind of space that we exist in. But then also you can look at the NHS and how you would see that those that used emotional intelligence coaching yielded a much greater increase in EI, and then also the boost in their overall well-being. So the actual application of coaching emotional intelligence was and did permeate onwards and then also boost the overall well-being, whilst, and this is a really important factor, reducing clinical burnout, but obviously things that come with clinical burnout: stress, anxiety, increasing the ability to cope and such forth. So really important statistic there. And when we think about how it comes into and relates to um, the idea of sporting, this is more of a sporting one, 3Cs, where you would have closeness, commitment, and co-orientation, and how that worked. And that would, if those things, which are obviously built within emotional intelligence, have a predictor on the performance, accolades, satisfaction, levels of motivation, all the things that are essentially important for the emotional well-being of the athlete, and then subsequently their ongoing level of performance within their whatever sport they were playing. So some real kind of like hard hit home statistics there, which I think are important to you know, acknowledge. Prevention is far better route than the magnitude of the work that has to be done to reach a cure. So if we are in a situation where we've lost the dressing room, so to speak, to get it back is far greater a set of work and length of work and application than actually putting in some level of prevention from an emotional intelligence perspective. So getting it in rather than being reactive is and has to be the way forward. Here we have the empathy paradox. Now, empathy is a tricky one because getting it right and making sure that it's in a position whereby you are not enabling or i.e., too much empathy, causing stagnation within the idea of the journey that that person's going on, and validating excuses or creating too much of unchallenged, comfortable environment because you are over empathetic. And that in the industry is happening a lot, whereby people are spinning their wheels, so to speak, with their clients and actually just putting people on monthly recurring revenues, and in a situation where, you know, empathy is so important, but the client's not actually getting anywhere, and it's becoming a very distinctive shift towards almost like just renting some sort of space to vent or whatever the case may be. And for my own personal position, I've been in that situation as a coach over the years, and I've had to reflect and go, what is going on here? Subsequently, had to recontract with the client to make sure that there is an understanding around how we still need to be pushing towards various goals that were discussed at the start, to make sure there isn't this kind of plateau and acceptance of a plateau through over large amounts of empathy being in the session or in the relationship. Flipping it the other way, punitive climate, where you find that there is almost a sense of retraction of empathy or suppression of empathy that's not actually allowed to play its role within the coaching relationship. Again, an issue whereby that creates a very different approach to the coaching journey, often from fear or worry or concern, where the person may withdraw or reflect on their own position within their journey if it's plateaued with regards to, you know, kind of failure almost. So there is this, you know, mix of getting it right, which is where you find a sense of empathetic accountability. The green box here, as you can see, we are essentially looking to find that position. We can be empathetic, we can stay curious, we can challenge where appropriate, we can create the engagement of behavior change and the willingness to step into positions of discomfort, but know that there is a sense of support at the right magnitude to allow that step to be made. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing with empathy, is getting that right, and getting it right on a client by client basis, and also not just a client by client, but where along the journey of that coaching experience you need to tweak and adjust slightly that variance in accountability to make sure it's appropriate for that time for that client. So obviously the empathy paradox and how that can work for us as coaches, but also it can work and undermine us as well. So I've just taking a breath for a minute and tapping into our spirituality is a very interesting, I wouldn't say it's a phenomenon, but it's something that which has come to prevalence and definitely on the radar is the idea of spirituality, which connects quite nicely with things like, like the nervous system as well. In essence, we're looking at the idea of how spirituality is being used in order to be able to create a direction that someone goes with regard to the decisions they're making, the coaching journey they're on. Now, I have to caveat this because what I don't want to do is be seen as someone who doesn't have a spiritual side to me. So I do have a spiritual side to me. However, as this would show upon the slide, is that there comes a point where spirituality and there's actually a sense of actuality where you have everything happens for a reason, and that acts on a continuum. On one end you have the very laissez-faire, everything's cool, everything's fine, just good vibrations only, let's just kind of hold ourselves, and which is one side of the spectrum. And then you have the other side of the spectrum where it's very almost cynical and like, no, someone's done that to try and do me over or something like that. So that is a continuum, actuality continuum. Now, spirituality is something that holds a purpose in order to be able to help people explain things and understand things and make decisions. But there is a line where if if it's being used to as an excuse, or if it's being used as a way of avoidance, or if it's being used as a way to almost circumnavigate the negative experience or traumatic experience, or if it's being used to present false forgiveness over something, which often happens within spirituality, someone goes, oh, we should forgive them. It's like, well, hang on a minute, there's a bit of work to be done before the forgiveness. But spirituality sometimes skips that bit, the challenging conversation or the potentially confrontational conversation. And then that actually creates this thing called dissociation function, where people end up just using spirituality to detach from the actual situation that's in play. And it's worth, because we're going to have different clients from different perspectives along that spectrum. Some will believe in fate to the nth degree, and others will believe the world out to get them to the nth degree. So we're going to get clients that exist along that spectrum, and we, as coaches, have to decide where spirituality is being used, underused, or misused to, stall, which would essentially undermine or stall a coaching journey. So I just wanted to rise this up and kind of put it on a bit of a radar, so to speak, because it's a very interesting concept that I see more and more of within, the health, fitness, well-being coaching domain. We have a dark side of emotional intelligence, because everything has its shadow, the yin and the yang, so to speak, and we do have this cascading effect where emotional intelligence can become weaponized. So the vulnerable can be exploited. The idea of manufactured scarcity, or this effect of like bamboozling people a bit and kind of making them not really get to grips with what's happening, and confusion obviously then opens the door for manipulation. And then we have the idea of where there's almost objection invalidation, which can come across as a bit gaslighting. Now, I've got a very relevant and situation whereby when the coach looks to sign someone up for whatever reason, health fitness, or even if it's like on the broader sense of coaching, there is a certain amount of ethical nature where during sales and during that consultation period, it's very important that emotional intelligence is used appropriately, whereby there isn't the kind of false rapport or empathy built in place, which can then reveal personal insecurities and then be used against that person, which happens. We then see the idea of I've only got 2 spaces left, or this offer is only going to last for so long. That manufactured scarcity, which actually then puts people into almost a fear of missing out, or almost the nervous system becomes activated in a sense of unable to process something as well as it could do if it was in like a natural and like a state of calmness. And then the objective invalidation, the idea where if someone has kind of boundaries or things in place which are expectations, and then them being undermined or pushed back on, when in fact it's theirs to have, and they are well within their rights to have those kind of, if it's a financial boundary or expectation or what have you. So these things can become weaponized quite easily in the wrong hands, and they do, and I see it a lot. And I had the exact thing happen in I overheard a conversation in the gym where someone was essentially um, invalidating objections that someone was putting up, and that person actually ended up signing up with that individual. And I've stepped in, spoken to the gym manager, and highlighted the issue at play, because that person has essentially been taken advantage of. So, as much as to say that we're in a health, fitness, well-being industry where good things happen, they also are accompanied by some not so good things as well when it comes to the use of emotional intelligence. When we have the idea of uh, the clean idea of coaching, and this is an interesting slide because I love a metaphor and I love an analogy, as some of you will know, but it is very important. Like, I have a connection with an emotional connection with a certain metaphor or analogy, and I interject that within a coaching space. That can often come with my own perceptions, and that can often come with um, a sense of bias, which I have to obviously be careful with when I'm coaching, because in some of the deeper coaching as well, it has to be uh, monitored and reflected on accordingly, so it doesn't take up the space in the client, with the client's mind, and what their perception is and what their own metaphor formulation might be. So the idea of clean coaching and using neutral syntax and being able to have a sense of openness without I mean, you can use metaphors to a certain degree, but if you're just a metaphor coach, then things are going to get quite murky quite quickly. So, being able to understand the client's own perceptions and metaphors, and if they connect with that, and then you obviously have, when they can process something like that, there is an emotional response to that. They understand it. They feel a certain amount of, when understanding comes, they might feel a certain sense of joy, happiness, relief, all of these things. So it can be very useful, but it also has to be accompanied with some very clean questions and very non-led questions, which are curious by nature. Otherwise, we can become potentially the dynamic can change between the coach and the coachee, whereby if you are becoming too much of a prevalent analogy metaphor giver, or there's the idea of bias comes into play too much, then that can obviously undermine the coaching situation journey. The role of AI in emotional intelligence. Now, there's going to be some people listening to this which are going to be ears are going to be pricking up. So this is really important. I know that we sing off the same hymn sheet anyway. So when we think about the role of AI in emotional intelligence and what it can do, and how it's imperative that the human stays well within that loop. So, and it's become more spoken about, especially in some of the groups which I'm in, whereby the AI can do a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of the crunching of data and the propositioning of ways forward and revealing of maybe patterns and data that could shape decision making of a human. The human then has to play their role very prevalently in order to be able to make that data, that pattern determination, come to fruition and be useful. The idea of then the human, if it's especially within a synchronous coaching session, i.e., where you're talking backwards and forwards, attunement to nervous system, whether it's regulated, dysregulated, being able to effectively co-regulate, notice nuances, understand around uh, temporal language, silences, tones, inflections, and then obviously feeling the energy shift. I say energy, relational shift, or dropping off of engagement or re-engaging in that sense as well within the actual coaching session itself. None of which AI can't really do. So um, the idea of AI and its role being used in emotional intelligence is essentially critical in the way in which we are moving forward within technology and within coaching. And although it can't, and this is a tricky one, I don't believe that AI can necessarily be emotionally intelligent, but I do believe it can pick up on emotional intelligence. That's how I feel about the kind of role that it's playing at the moment within in coaching and the emotional intelligence integration. We have the idea of this window of tolerance when we think about emotional um, well-being of an individual and whether the idea of that person being able to operate in that window of tolerance. And this is, I think, one of the things that seems to be coming up a lot more is around how trauma-informed coaching and how that can play a role. Obviously, that links in with emotional intelligence in the sense of the decisions that are being made by the coaches that are delivering this kind of work. And the breakdown of this is around someone in a optimal position where they can fully understand, become aware of, regulate, process, plan accordingly around the idea of how they want to move forward during the coaching journey. Now, we are not in a position of coaches to eliminate stress, therefore, we're always in the window of optimal functioning. But what we should be doing as coaches is understand how that person can implement a strategy to allow them to not become hyper aroused or hypo aroused and be able to maintain some kind of equilibrium in that sense. And the shift, the emotional intelligence shift, which I think is happening and is being delivered, is asking to to use language along the lines of exploratory curiosity. What's happened? Let's go through this. Let's understand more about you, rather than being very prescriptive, or this is what we need to do, or prescriptive in a sense of what is wrong with you. So trying to diagnose too much. And if we can understand the way in which this approach can help people stay within this window of tolerance, because you ask questions that bump them up or make them dissociate or put them into a place where they are anxious or panicking or feeling under more stress, you lose them with that coaching session. So the way in which trauma informed coaching can play its role or emotional intelligence plays its role within trauma-informed coaching, which is becoming more prevalent, is a lot more to do with how we're asking questions and how we're maintaining that person within that window in order to be able to make sure the coaching session is productive and does move us forward within the journey. It's probably quite relevant from that point to this point, just to now mention around boundaries between coaching and psychotherapy, scope of practice. Um, the coaching is a lot more about forward thinking, present and future orientation, grounding, nervous system regulation, absolutely fine. Goal setting, self actualization, and getting someone to stay within that window of tolerance. On, if they go out of it and then come back in a bit, that's fine. But like, if they're out of it on a very consistent place, then that's what often a sign where we may be looking at more of a psychotherapy, counselling, or therapeutic approach, where it might be, depending on the scope of practice, more diagnostics. It could be delving into a little bit more around the reason why that person is out of that window of tolerance, and clinical pathology, and stabilization, which can be like obviously medical intervention and stuff like that. So moving from, sometimes this window of tolerance, if you are coaching someone who is, if you're coaching someone, let's go back to this side, if you're coaching someone who is essentially had a bit of a rough time, they might drop in and out. They might go out of this window of tolerance, right? And as a trauma-informed coach, or being able to understand this, knowing when to go, okay, we've been out of this window for too long now. This has got to kind of like go into another person's domain. We need to bring someone else in to support in this particular journey. So it's often a good, the window of tolerance can be a good way of determining whether it might be worth getting another professional in or broadening that up. But overall, morals, ethics, and do no harm, which is pretty much a very standard and hopeful place that any coach would be looking to find themselves. We look at this could probably be developed, to be honest with you, into a little bit more of a deeper dive around the idea of what looks like an emotionally mastered coach. Self-awareness, regulation, being able to understand or have some sort of connection, reading your own nervous system, and also the client's nervous system to a certain degree, and then having that empathetic accountability, balancing compassionate validation with goal-focused behavioral challenges. And that's the sweet spot, like we were saying in that empathy paradox. It's kind of balancing it where it needs to be and adjusting it and calibrating it at the right time with the right client. Cleaning up communication. So we were mentioning around that kind of use of metaphors or analogies, and making sure that there is the majority of it non-directive, clear communication, non-practitioner bias. I like a bit of metaphor and analogy, and I think it can really be useful to unlock a certain amount, but being able to manage and be reflective on that, on the amount that it's used. And then that kind of boundary in intelligence, when it comes down to, is this within my scope of practice? We're in this window of tolerance. Brilliant. We're out of it. How long are we out for it? Do we need to look at other options? So what does an emotionally intelligent coach look like in 2030, which is rapidly approaching, which is terrifying? That's when the next World Cup's going to be. So, which I'm sure England are going to bring it home again. So we have a kind of like competencies, and it's just very loose, kind of a couple of ideas that were brought up, which I thought I'd throw onto a slide. So, when you think about, they're skillful, they're not just emotional. So emotion, that the emotions are at play, but they're skilled in being able to understand, utilize, uh, and process them in the appropriate manner. They know when to lean in, they know when to challenge, they know when to regulate the nervous system, or when the regulation of the nervous system is required. they know when to refer out to a clinician, and they know when to stay silent and appreciate what happens in those quieter times. So bit of a rip through there on what emotional intelligent coaching looks like at the moment, how I believe it's showing up or in positive and negative ways, and things to watch out for at the moment in the industry. Yeah, so thanks for listening, guys. I'm going to pop up the questions now. We're going to break out, and these are the questions here again. If you haven't taken a screenshot, and then we're going to break out and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about these and or any of the other slides that have come up.